Hello again. My name is Dr. Patricia Coughlin. Today, I'll be talking with you about how to achieve agreement with your patients regarding the therapeutic task. So far, John Fredrickson and I have talked with you about how to get an agreement about the problems to be addressed, as well as some shared understanding of the driving forces responsible for the problems. Now we must also get clear and get agreement about the treatment goals and the therapeutic tasks required to achieve those goals. Patients often want a positive outcome, but don't necessarily want to face what they have to face to get there. They might have a wish that you alone could cure them, for example. We need to remind patients and ourselves that only hard work will result in the goals they seek. To some extent, all patients enter therapy with this kind of ambivalence. They want to feel better, but don't necessarily want to have to do what they need to do to get there. In ISTDP, we do not shy away from such conflicts. In fact, Dr. Davenlew discovered that the best and most direct pathway to change is to intensify this conflict between the healthy part of the patient, willing to do whatever is necessary to heal and recover, and the part of the patient that resists and even sabotages this process. So let's look at some examples. A middle-aged man came to see me to get help with temper outbursts that were very distressing to him and to his family. This man had grown up with a violent and tyrannical father, and he had promised himself never to repeat that pattern. While in fact he had never physically harmed anyone, as his father had, he found himself having verbal outbursts, and he realized that these were also very damaging. So the problem was clear, these temper outbursts. When I asked him about the goal, he was also very clear. He said, "I don't want to do that anymore." Now, while that might sound like a fine goal at first blush, it's actually what we would call a negative or avoidant goal. The patient knows what he doesn't want to do, but that doesn't lead us anywhere. We don't proceed until the patient can articulate a positive approach goal. What does he actually want? The patient was stumped when I asked him what he wanted. He only knew what he didn't want. As we began to examine specific situations in which he would explode, it became clear that the triggers were relatively benign. In fact, he was so afraid of his anger that he habitually suppressed and avoided it. The result of this avoidance was a buildup over time of anger and resentment that made blowing his top inevitable. He was surprised to discover that his original solution to the problem of anger, which was to avoid it at all costs, was actually responsible for his current problem, verbal outbursts. So once he saw this clearly, we could begin to map out the therapeutic task. Since the underlying cause of his outbursts was the habitual suppression of anger and irritation, the task was to become aware of anger, even at low levels, so he could deal with it immediately and constructively. As long as he continued to stuff his anger, then this pattern of avoidance, buildup, explosion, remorse, and renewed avoidance was just going to continue. So we were able to agree that our task was to help him face his anger directly. It turns out that he was not only suppressing his anger, but he was also displacing it. As we began the work of paying attention to his anger, retaliatory rage toward his brutal father emerged. We were then able to work this through at the source so that his need to displace his anger onto others disappeared. Not only did he stop having these verbal temper tantrums at home, he actually started to open up and develop real emotional closeness with his wife and children. He became especially close to his son and was finally able to achieve what he really wanted, a happy, healthy family. Now let's look at another example. A young woman, married for 3 years with a 2-year-old daughter, came to therapy wondering if she had married the wrong man. While she described her husband as loving and devoted, she said that she had lost that loving feeling for him. She began to wonder if she'd ever had those feelings in the first place. Perhaps she had simply married the wrong guy. She also found herself fantasizing about the man she dated before she got married, He was a handsome and charismatic fellow, but chronically unfaithful and often cruel. How is it that she could be pining for such a man? So here was the problem. She was half in and half out of her marriage and wondering if she should end it. Her goal was clear, to get clear about this and make the best decision. We could agree on the content, but I noticed something very striking about the process of how she was expressing herself. As she spoke about herself, she tended to laugh and make light of things that were clearly very serious. I started to block those defenses. Do you notice that you're laughing as you talk about these very serious matters? It's not funny, so what's the laugh about? I wanted to assess how present and aware she was of how she was communicating. She was, in fact, aware of her laughter, and she said she did it all the time. Now, if we proceeded in this way, both taking her lightly, laughing it off, we could certainly not achieve her goals. While laughing over her true feelings clearly wasn't helpful, we needed to get clear about the healthy alternative. So I asked her, "Are you willing to take yourself seriously?" She began to cry and revealed that this was a huge problem for her. She had never been able to take herself, her feelings, her needs, and her desires seriously. In fact, she went on to report that she had a tendency to actively sabotage and undermine herself. Whenever she started to experience success, whether at school or in sports, she would suddenly quit and drop out. Now we were getting a fuller and deeper view of the problem at hand. In fact, the current issue with her husband was only the most recent example of an entrenched pattern of sabotaging everything and anything that was good in her life. So we could now agree on the task, which was to take her seriously and have an honest look at her feelings, needs, and desires. Therapy could now begin in earnest. Once patient and therapist agree on the goals and the tasks required to achieve those goals, they can work together and solidify their collaborative alliance. Failure to achieve agreement about the task can result in stalled therapies or outright disagreement about how to achieve therapeutic ends. Often, patient and therapist have very different ideas about how to proceed. We do not try to convince our patients that it's a good idea to face their feelings. Instead, we inquire about the nature of the problem, we examine examples in detail until it becomes clear that avoidance of their feelings is the driving force to their symptoms and suffering. If we don't get this agreement, the conflict is going to be between the patient and the therapist rather than between the forces within the patient. We want to intensify the patient's internal conflict until he decides which way to go. If the patient chooses not to have an honest look at himself, which is certainly his prerogative, then there's no basis for psychotherapy. I'll never forget a man who came to see me at the insistence of his primary physician. He had been having panic attacks as well as intrusive thoughts and images about hurting his son. He wanted this to stop and went to see his physician to get some medication. Well, the physician thought this sounded like an emotional problem and he wanted him assessed by a therapist. So this was the doctor's wish, not the desire of the patient. Still, the patient was there in my office, so I began to inquire about the symptoms, when it began, what triggered it. After about 10 minutes, he stopped and he said, "Listen, Doc, let me tell you something. I think you're probably pretty good at what you do, and if I ever decide that I want to understand myself and why I'm having these thoughts, I'm certainly going to come to see you. But you know what? I don't want to know. I just want them to stop, and I want some medication. I'm only here because the doctor said I had to see you before he would prescribe." Now, this was as clear a communication as he could possibly have given me. In fact, I had no permission to continue to inquire about his inner life. Even though we agreed about the problem, these intrusive thoughts and images, and about the goal, to free him of this torment, we had no agreement about the therapeutic task. He wanted medication, and I was offering psychotherapy. Ultimately, it's up to the patient to decide which way he wants to go. It's not our job to hook or persuade patients, but to be fully available to those who have some desire to examine what is going on inside of themselves. Again, without agreement about the task, patient and therapist are often working at cross purposes. When therapists are first introduced to ISTDP, they're often so motivated to get to these feelings that they jump in prematurely, asking patients about their feelings and impulses before having any agreement that such a task makes sense. Then the patient either complies with the will of the therapist or feels misunderstood. A misalliance can develop if the therapist and the patient are not in agreement. So take your time. One of my first ISTDP teachers taught me, go slow in the beginning, and then you'll go fast in the end. If you take your time and get agreement about the nature of the problems to be addressed, the patient's goals, and the therapeutic task, your therapies will become smoother and more effective. Thanks for visiting the ISTDP Institute website.